On a frost-bitten morning in 1603, the great theatre of England fell silent. Elizabeth Tudor, Gloriana, Astrea, the Virgin Queen, lay motionless in a darkened chamber at Richmond. Heavy damask strangled the windows. The candles hissed and guttered. The air wore a tang of incense and iron, like a chapel after battle. Her ladies moved as if upon consecrated floorboards, their steps rehearsed, their grief drilled into courtly order. For 45 years she had conducted Europe as if it were a consort of lutes, with glances for trills, decrees for resolutions. Now the instrument of that will lay still, a presence more palpable than any living body in the palace. A physician coughed. A chaplain turned the pages of his Latin with trembling fingers. Someone's rosary rattled in a pocket like rain in a small gutter. The kingdom waited in breathless posture, and in that pause the rumor, always faster than truth, took on hoofs and wings. They had watched her wane. In the final weeks she refused the bed, refused food, refused even speech, standing like a votive figure to some iron god only she could see, a statue unblessed, eyes fixed upon a point just beyond mortal distance. When her knees betrayed her, she sank to the rushes, but demanded to be lifted upright again. "I will not be undone," she told one doctor who dared touch her pulse. The phrase lashed the room like a whip. She saw shapes in corners, shadows that moved when the candles were still, and though she would not confess, her lips worked at Latin, tatters of psalms and the rough breaths of the creed. She had outstared assassins, confounded popes, made giants of scholars and worms of princes. Yet in the end what she could not outstare was her own house of flesh. The mask of sovereignty, the precise collar and the gravid sleeves, the ruff like a white star, had become armor that weighed upon the bones. The body, stubborn as a mulish acolyte, would no longer keep the hours. When the last resistance drained, the room seemed to lean inward. They unhooked the jeweled stomacher, set aside the brooches, unwound the stiffened laces that had cinched her for decades, and what lay beneath the brocade stunned them into a colder silence. Not death, that was expected, even merciful, but revelation. Her famed alabaster was not a gift of angels. It was a mixture of vinegar and white lead, ceruse beaten to a paste and perfumed into a devotional lie. Layer upon layer, reapplied every day for 2 generations, had become a second skin. As the attendants washed the face with damp linen, the paint sloughed away in strips like the peels of a long-kept apple. And under that artifice the truth bruised through, mottles black-green like overripe fruit. Blisters along the temples, flesh cured to leather in places, tender as an infant's ear in others. The chamber did not cry out because there are cries that end kingdoms. Instead there were inhalations too sharp to be prayers. What was visible upon the face repeated itself upon the torso. They unbound the linen, lifted the chemise, and saw the lattice-work of pressure, ribs pressed inward from a lifetime of ceremonial posture, a spine that bent not with age alone but with habit, the curves of bone that you see in religious diptychs where martyrs are displayed in anatomical allegory. Across the left breast and near the collar, here is where the room looked down, lay an ulcerated mass, swaddled in makeshift bandages that had been changed in secrecy, perhaps by the Queen herself, perhaps by one careful hand sworn to a wordless oath. Was it an abscess that never drained, a malignancy that learned the court's etiquette and bowed toward the heart? The language of the day had few terms for such betrayals. Physicians called persistent wounds cankers or eating sores, as if appetite itself had turned upon its hostess. Whatever it was, it had supped upon her in silence while she supped upon empire. The doctors, men of gravity, trained to read humors as if reading comets, asked the room for privacy and were granted it by a nod from the lord of the bedchamber. Sovereigns were not dissected like commoners. Royal bodies served as sacraments as much as corpses. Yet the need to know, sharpened by terror, overcame the rubric. Behind a half-closed screen they examined what history would never officially record. When the abdomen was opened, the air in the chamber curdled. Not the Swedish neutrality of ordinary death, but something sharp, metallic, bride of vinegar and furnace. They found a liver hard and dark as a cinder, kidneys brittle as parchment, the interior tissues stained as if by soot. As one physician described it in a later, carefully veiled letter, not corruption alone, but an inward mineral wasting. We, with the benefit of unpoetic chemistry, would call it lead. A queen murdered slowly by her mirror. Cosmetics were not the only culprits. Lead was a household god in Tudor England. It lined cisterns and sweetened wines. It calmed the face as surely as it embalmed the blood. Physicians prescribed it in plasters. Apothecaries calibrated it as if it could be domesticated by piety. For a woman required to be more symbol than person, a little poison became a daily communion. Each morning the court repainted the miracle, and each night the miracle exacted its toll. In the private account books of the wardrobe, you find entries for ceruse as you find entries for diamonds. Both were expenditures upon the same altar, their Gloriana lit to a constant white. More shocking still, to minds that measured virtue by fertility, was the report of the womb. One royal doctor described it in a phrase that rattled through 2 centuries of rumor. Withered to parchment. No softness, no robust branching of vessels, only a dry remnant. A kind of dusty reliquary within the reliquary. To the pious around the bed, this confirmed her chastity, as if heaven had signed the body with a seal. To us it has other languages: endocrine disorder, premature ovarian failure, an anomaly of development like MRKH. The final diagnosis matters less than the lesson the body taught, that a public myth can be buttressed by a private infirmity. She had joked she was wed to England. Perhaps she was telling the only truth she could bear. Around that secret examination flapped older crows. The Bisley Boy legend, an imposture story whispered in Gloucestershire alehouses, claimed the real Elizabeth died in childhood, and a local boy, well-schooled and carefully costumed, took her place to save counselors from Henry's rage. Every few decades, the rumor put on new boots and walked again. It is sensational, and historians rightly throttle it with skepticism. Yet there are letters, more shadows than ink, that speak of attendants startled by odd proportions, a rib cage too broad, a hip too narrow. And there is the stubborn fact that once she died, the chamber was sealed, witnesses dismissed to far shires, and the coffin prepared with unusual haste and unusual architecture, double-lined with lead, bound in iron, clamped like a treaty. Secrecy is the most persuasive accomplice of speculation, but the state had reasons more sober than scandal to move like thunder. Elizabeth was not merely a sovereign. She was the liturgy of Protestant survival. To show her mortally disfigured would have been to invite sermons about divine displeasure, to feed Catholic pulpits from Edinburgh to Rome with feast day meat. The transition to James, the Scottish king with Tudor blood, had to occur in a single clean gesture, blade fast and trumpet loud. And so it did. Before most Londoners knew the Queen was gone, the bells were retuned for a new monarch. The preachers were equipped with homilies praising her victories, not her veins. The ladies who had seen too much were given quiet pensions and a geography lesson. The news that reached the streets was not the news that had passed between 2 hands in a cold chamber. That version was buried twice, once in lead, once in silence. Now consider the procession. Banners like small theaters, trumpets slivering the air, white lilies in ropes, red roses like wounds stitched into garlands. A populace that had grown up under her looked upon the coffin and saw not a box but a mirror. The myth had worked too well. The myth had become a commons. Painters hailed her not with the precision of likeness but with the grammar of vision, widening the shoulders, whitening the skin, hardening the gaze. The older she grew, the more she became an emblematic angel, forever at the noon of a sun that exists only on coats of arms. The theater of mourning maintained that noon even as the night of chemistry gathered inside her. Centuries passed. Monarchs were born and buried. The empire wove and frayed. But in Westminster Abbey, stone forest of the English dead, the effigy remained in serene dominion. Her tomb has never been open for science. The Church refuses politely, repetitively, with the calm of an institution that has learned to outlast curiosity. Scholars, antiquarians, physicians of the Victorian type who would measure everything down to the sigh of a saint have asked for a sample, just a chip of bone, a tuft of hair. The answer is a velvet-gloved no. We have portraits, wardrobe remnants, a funerary effigy molded from her death mask. We have recipe books that read like grim pharmacopoeias. We have diplomats' dispatches reporting headaches, vertigos, winter illnesses prolonged by summer stubbornness. We have everything but the one proof that would allow the dead to speak without metaphor, the body. And so the body continues to govern the story by not entering it. We can still, with decency, read the clues. A scan of her effigy reveals a jaw that leans, a neck slightly tilted. The bodices preserved from her reign are not garments so much as architectural constraints, waists drawn into a geometry that bone must eventually resent. Her recipes call for ceruse so freely that you can measure illness in ounces, and there are letters from foreign envoys commenting on the thickness of her paint as one comments on the state of harvests. Lace and poison are interleaved throughout the archive. Combine these traces and you may imagine the private century of pain. Migraines like iron circlets, dizzy spells that would have toppled a less stubborn monarch, the endless itch of poisoned skin concealed beneath the calm of lace. Power is a stagecraft, yes, but also an endurance. It is tempting, then, to make her a saint of suffering, a woman who bore the cannibalism of cosmetics so that a nation could see itself radiant. Tempting and maybe just, yet we must allow her agency to be complicated. She was told by physicians that the paint gnawed her. She allowed it to remain. She understood that the corset cinched not just fabric but bone. She tightened the laces. There is a cruelty that power inflicts upon those who bear it, an obligation to appear timeless in order to keep time moving. In an age that demanded that a queen be both virgin and mother to the realm, she chose the only motherhood available to her body, the manufacturing of an image large enough to carry inheritance. Paint served where blood could not. Soft tissue failed, so pearl and starch in ceremony performed the necessary fertility. If that makes of her a tragic artist, then the canvas was her own skin, and the audience a country. Return to the death room, the chaplain murmurs. The physicians bandage for decency what their curiosity had unbandaged. The principal secretary drafts letters that begin with euphonies and end with instructions. Outside the palace, the river keeps its schedule. Barges bump. Crows revise their argument with the sky. We think of death as a stopping. For kings, it is often a machine whirring into higher speed. The more frail the body, the more elaborate the gears. And so, while she lay between linen and decree, London was already adapting. Printers setting up panegyrics, merchants calculating new risks, spies writing to old enemies with new salutations. Elizabeth, even in her silence, choreographed every motion in that room, because she had spent her life training them all to move to a music only she fully heard. What of the legend that never learns fatigue? The imposture, the boy of Bisley. Serious historians, whose work is a priesthood of skepticism, demote it to folklore, and rightly. Yet its persistence tells us something equally important, that her reign located itself at the porous border between performance and reality. She knew it. Her counselors knew it. Her enemies wrote pamphlets about it. Her painters conspired in it. When the state controls the grammar of image, all stories become plausible in the shadows. Whether or not the legend breathes fact, it is truer than truth in a cultural sense. Elizabeth resexed the concept of sovereignty, presented an androgynous authority at times hard and angular, at times dressed in virginal pageantry. She made gender a statecraft. That is why portraits harden as the decades pass. The queen becomes icon, becomes concept, as if a nation were airbrushing its god into focus. Follow the procession to Westminster. Trumpets slice the cold. Black horses stamp. The coffin is a dark geometry upon men's shoulders. In windows, children stare with the fresh astonishment that concludes childhood. The heralds cry the titles, the roll call of God-parented history. France claimed, Ireland bound, Virginia named, and far oceans newly behaving like maps. If you squint, you can see the illusion that made an island feel planetary. Then the abbey, gray and golden, a reliquary that collects reliquaries. Down the nave the coffin glides. The organ swells a volume designed to terrify sin into silence. Her effigy waits, serene as arithmetic, carved from the death mask, lips set to a knowledge that is not speech. Beneath stone as old as preacher's bones, the lead-lined casket takes a position in the great conversation of English mortality. The lid says, "Do not ask." The stone says, "You will anyway." The state says, "Only in ways that keep you loyal." We return centuries later, bearing instruments of curiosity, CT scanners in our minds, pipettes of imagined DNA, spreadsheets, and peer review. The church says no with the same unhurried certainty with which it says creed. Why? Because the tomb is not only a casket of bone, but a tabernacle of narrative. To open it would be to invite an argument about the legitimacy of identity, the sanctity of Protestant destiny, the foundations of the empire's self-regard. It is easier, perhaps wiser, to protect the myth than to verify the person. Nations are skeins of story. Pull too hard and you unweave more than you meant. And yet, to be honest to her cleverness, consider this. Perhaps she would have approved. Elizabeth was a playwright without a theater to stand in, a director of gestures and silences. She understood that the human need for symbol outruns the appetite for fact. By making her body the cost of that symbol, she ensured her continued reign and absence. Her skin, consumed by ceruse, did not only succumb, it achieved something alchemical, turning pain into policy. She is still queen because she still presides over our questions. Was she a poisoned saint? A woman encaged by ritual? An imposture so perfect that it remade the country that believed it? Every theory is a form of homage to her mastery of narrative. Every refusal by the Abbey is a bow to her last command. The historian, honest, unromantic, will stop here to say, much of this is inference. The medical language is retrofitted. Identity swap tales belong to the country of rumor. True. But there is a different kind of truth the archive allows. Pattern. The pattern is of a woman whose physical suffering grew in proportion to the nation's appetite for her image, whose self-presentation hardened from flirtatious girl to angel of sovereignty, whose wardrobe became a cage built of obedience and expectation, whose physicians spoke in the riddles their century permitted, whose counselors learned the utility of secrecy, whose death dramatized the priority of politics over reality. We can map that without opening a coffin. We can, in the dim light of our own screens, understand the danger of a face that must be perfect in order for institutions to function. If you listen closely at Richmond, in that bedchamber where the drapes have long been cut into altar cloths by time, you might hear not the rattle of rosaries but the scratch of a quill. She was always rewriting the script. Even her silence in those final days reads like an authorship. If she would not confess, then no confession existed. If she would not lie down, then she had not surrendered. If she could still stand, she would still reign. We make saints of such obstinacy because we recognize in it something we need to believe about our own agencies. But it is also good to make a woman of her, to grant the pain its literalness, to name the ulcers as sores and the headaches as lead, to see the corset as carpentry rather than clouds. The miracle is not that she was divine. The miracle is that a human body could bear so much theater and still play the part to curtain. And so we end where we began, with candles that spit, with curtains that hold their breath, with attendants who move like musicians reading from memorized scores. They lift their sovereign into cloth, not because she needs warmth now, but because the living do. They stitch the last seams of a myth that has kept them safe from enemies, internal and foreign, kept them believing, which is the only coinage governments ever truly mint. Outside, the Thames pushes its slate water toward the sea that made England's boast credible. Somewhere in a not-distant century, tourists will pass the Abbey's threshold. Their footsteps will sound like an army that has forgotten its cause. They will pause before the effigy. They will not know the chemistry of ceruse or the subtleties of endocrine dread. They will know only that the face is calm. That calm is the country's inheritance. What remains is a question that serves as epilogue and thesis. Which is more dangerous to a nation, the private decay of a sovereign, or the public knowledge of it? The answer in 1603 was certain: knowledge. Better a perfect corpse than a ruinous truth. That choice, repeated enough, becomes character. England chose image. Image obliged by becoming a kind of truth. Elizabeth understood this bargain and therefore still governs it. Her suffering became doctrine. Her mask, England's face. And the secret she carried is exactly where she left it. Sealed in lead, guarded by faith, protected by silence, an immaculate deception still doing the necessary work of state.